The I know it's obviously very difficult to snatch the time. Just before I start, a little bit of background on me and who I am. So I'm a consultant community pediatrician. I've been working in the field for over 25, 30 years, and I have been working most of that time locally in Kingston and Richmond. And certainly neurodiversity has been a strong interest for me. And I've known of the Skylarks charity and the Girls Connect for many years and the wonderful support that they offer. Um, when I was asked to give a talk, I had to think about the sort of topics that come up for the clients and the people that connect with me, and hence the title of the talk today, trying to get the right support, assessments, and diagnosis, and unpicking the myths. That's certainly the sort of things that I do and when I'm working with families. Oops. Oh, there we go. So the first thing to talk about is, do we want assessment and support, or do we want just a label? Now, of course, nobody wants just a label, but that's what tends to happen in my professional experience. And I have a lot of families coming to me when they have got a diagnostic label, but really don't really know how to help their child. And that I would say would not have been obviously the best assessment process, because it always should be about assessing a child and focusing on need and ensuring that the families have support. Um, you don't necessarily need a diagnosis. And I would always say be wary of people that are marketing diagnostic packages and one-stop shops. And that tends to happen quite a lot. And the way that I practice myself is that I always like to start at the beginning and listen to the parents and to work out what type of assessments and support may be required, rather than starting with an actual attempt at a diagnosis, because that could be quite wrong. Okay. So, as I'm sure many have experienced, it's a real minefield, an assessment process. What are you asking for? Who do you go to? Obviously, very long waiting lists, frustration, being told, for example, that you can't get support without an assessment, which isn't true. Um, when you're waiting, people Google, they search, and then come up with ideas for assessment themselves. And one of the very common ones more recently is things like pathological demand avoidance, yet there is no true assessment for that, and there is no agreed diagnosis definition. Also, sometimes families are searching out and wanting to understand their child and their potential profile and how to support them. And I see families who've paid a lot of money for a profile, but that's not really something that's certainly within the NICE guidelines, and not necessarily particularly helpful. All right, just going to get this to try and work. Okay. So for me, the most important thing is to define the need. And it's really important to focus on the SEN code of practice, um, which does not require diagnosis. It's based on need. Now, this can obviously complement a diagnostic process, but instead it's chicken and egg. It's just much more important to try and define that, and every individual is unique. Um, so it's just really important. Sometimes may say that they can't get support without a diagnosis. That is not true. So that's actually coming back to one of the myths that we'll talk about a bit later. So I'm looking at what is autistic spectrum disorder. Now, that may be one of the issues for your child, not necessarily. Nobody quite knows until you've done a proper assessment. So what is it? It's a lifelong developmental difference. It shows children who show autism have it's a difference. And it's defined through many different definitions, but the DSM-5, ICD-11, and also NICE guidelines are normally the standard diagnostic references. I think it's really important, and I will talk and keep referencing back to the NICE guidelines. for identification and initial assessment for a child if it's we're talking about possible autism. So what are we looking for? So we're looking for persistent difficulties in social interaction, persistent difficulties in social communication, stereotypic or rigid or repetitive behaviors, and a change to restricted interests, and one or more of the following: problems in obtaining or sustaining employment, difficulties initiating or sustaining relationships, previous or current mental health difficulties, which certainly is something that I'm seeing more and more of in the clients that I'm working with, and a history of neurodevelopmental conditions such as learning disabilities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and there seems to be a fashion for assessing for ADHD and autism at the same time, and a new formulation of AU-ADHD. So diagnosis can be important to direct support, although it shouldn't define it. If you do have a diagnosis, then you will should be supported under the Equality Act, and it can really help with further education, training, and work in adult life. It can also try and help direct teacher training. So if you have a diagnosis, it's really important to try and make sure that the teachers have specific training. As we all know, with if you have children, that in the dreaded inset days, on those days when you have to look after the children, that the teachers are being trained, it's really worth asking whether are the teachers actually having training in neurodiversity. Access to resources and benefits and diagnosis can help, but it must not be seen as a barrier. It's things like disability living allowance. I always try and recommend families to apply for disability living allowance. It's not means tested. You do not have to have a diagnosis, and it can really help. As you'll see as we go through the talk, I'm going to be recommending specific therapeutic assessments, and everything costs because with waiting lists in the NHS, families are often seeking private assessments, and that's incredibly costly, and therapies. So I'd really say to any of you that if you're struggling with a child who has a potential disability and you haven't done so, do apply for disability living allowance and reach out to the local charities to try and help you fill in the form, because it is very long and really quite tricky. But it really can help, and I believe it's backdated from when you apply. So what is autistic spectrum disorder? Now, the circles on this slide are not very clear, so we'll go through those in the next slide. But it's just there to show you how very, very complex this is and how many comorbidities there are. So, of course, the most common one is ADHD. I see many children who have a poor sleep pattern. Things like post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, developmental coordination disorder, which is sometimes termed as dyspraxia, but there is no actual true definition of dyspraxia. So yeah, the only one that you can formally assess for is developmental coordination disorder. Speech and language disorder, oppositional defiance and conduct disorder, sensory integration and difficulties with interoception, anxiety and depression, medical or genetic difficulties or conditions, intellectual disability, and undiagnosed medical issues such as thyroid dysfunction, and psychosocial issues such as adverse childhood experiences. And I certainly work with a number of families who have adopted children who have had very significant adverse childhood experiences. So to summarize, not surprisingly, it's most children are unique. Every child is different, and it's a square peg into a round hole. It's not always easy to assess and diagnose using one format or one very simple format. And it really is important to start at the beginning and to take developmental history. And to summarize, really one size does not fit all, as we'll see as we go along. So going back to the assessment pathway, it's really important to work out who can actually assess. And that's something that I come against quite a lot, is the qualifications and the quality of the assessments. So it's important to get the name of the assessors, their credentials, and their experience working with children with SEN and complex needs. Are they suitably qualified, and do they fit the NICE guideline recommendations in terms of their ability to assess, which we will discuss. So what are those NICE guidelines? So a middle line, and it can be quite realistic, but in each area there should be a multidisciplinary group, and which should comprise a pediatrician and or a child and adolescent psychiatrist, a speech and language therapist, and a psychologist with training and experience working with autistic children and young people. The autism team should either include or have access to the following professionals if they are not already in the team: a pediatrician or pediatric neurologist, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, a psychologist, occupational and an occupational therapist. Okay. The benefit of this approach, that it highlights not only a diagnosis if it's present, but also the functional support that a child needs in every domain, including communication, cognition, sensory and executive function, behavior, social and emotional. And this in turn provides the recommendations for support. So one of the people that's was stated there was a speech and language therapist. And this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks I come across when I say to families that I'm recommending that their child should see a speech and language therapist. So I did a talk recently with a colleague that I do my own ADOS autism assessments with, who was a specialist speech and language therapist, and she helped give this talk. And these two slides are hers, where she really helpfully defined what is speech and language therapy. Well, it covers from birth to death. Understanding of language, using language, articulation, voice, fluency, but also social communication, swallowing and feeding disorders. But then say, but my child can talk. Why on earth would they want to see a speech and language therapist? Now, the specialist speech and language therapists that I work with, who I think are really crucial for assessing children with autism, and that's right through from children who are non-verbal to very high functioning children, is looking what we call higher level language. And that's looking at things like their ability to engage in a back and forth conversation, their ability to take on perspective, what we call often theory of mind, thinking about how someone else feels, using language for initiating and maintaining and terminating interactions in different contexts. And we talked about higher level language, understanding figurative language, idioms, sarcasm, and non-literal language. The other key professional that you saw at the bottom of those recommendations is an occupational therapist. A number of the children that I work with, and certainly classified within the DSM and ICD-10, have issues with sensory integration. And that can be an oversensitivity or undersensitivity to aspects of their environment, such as sound or light, and all sorts of other environments. And what they would do is assess and do a sensory profile. Emotional regulation. Some of these children really struggle with emotional regulation. Fine and gross motor skills, coordination and motor planning, executive function, organization, self-help and life skills, attention and concentration. And I think this pyramid of learning is really helpful as a concept to try and understand the value of the occupational therapist. If you look right down the bottom, you see all these issues with sensory integration, and which we were talking about this. So if you're having a sensory profile, if you're triggered by any of these things, such as tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive, visual, auditory, olfactory, that can really upset you, and then goes right up the pyramid. So although often there's a very strong focus on cognition, looking at perceptual and sensory motor, you can see that if the sensory integration is out of sync, how much that can impact that individual. So the speech and language therapists and occupational therapists for me are incredibly important within a whole assessment to understand your potential child's needs. So just going back to those nice guidelines, really important to consider which assessments are needed to understand the profile of the child, their intellectual ability and their learning style, their academic skills, their speech and language and communication, as we've just touched on, their fine and gross motor skills, adaptive behavior, including their self-help skills, mental and emotional health, physical health and nutrition. A lot of the children that I work with their sensory integration, they have very fussy eating, which sometimes can be classified as something called ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake. It is it's a very quite an exact definition, and not many children would meet the seriousness of the criteria, but many children are fussy with their food, and it can be quite a challenge. Sensory sensitivities, as we've just discussed, and behavior likely to affect their day-to-day function, including their social participation and socialization skills. So as we know, these are really difficult things. And you can see how incredibly complex that is and how very important it is to have that multi-professional assessment. A lot of children, certainly children with high cognitive function, mask and they survive in school. And I have many families that come to me where the school have said, well, my child's fine. They say they think they're fine here, that only when they come home do they dysregulate. So it's really important to understand that that autism masking means they have certainly have strong cognitive ability and ability to mask their autistic behaviors and try to mimic peers. But this can be absolutely exhausting for them. So important to think about. So if someone is masking, this involves them hiding their real thoughts and feelings in order to blend in or avoid criticism. Many people use masking in social settings, especially those who have neurodiverse conditions, to meet expectations and avoid judgment. And the emotional consequences of frequent masking means that they can cause emotional exhaustion and make individuals feel disconnected from their authentic selves. And I'm certainly seeing more and more children who are now what we call EBSA, who are demonstrating emotional-based school avoidance and the potential finding it really difficult to get into school, and worst case, and not in school. And these are the consequences if you do not carry out a thorough assessment with someone with individuals who are highly qualified. The National Autistic Society, this is their definition. So if you have a child that's masking, it's really important to go back to those nice guidelines, which they recognize that there can be discrepancies. And I have so many families, they said, well, they didn't meet the criteria on the ADOS, or they didn't meet our criteria on the 3DI. It's never supposed to be just on those standardized assessments. And if a child is really struggling and has extreme issues in that level of masking, it's really important to dig a bit deeper and think a bit harder and do some more investigation rather than just saying that the child at that time didn't meet criteria. So really important to gather additional information. And as it said, go and do observations in the clinical settings. One of the things I think is very valuable with the people that I work with, especially speech and language therapists and occupational therapists, is they will often go and do an observation in school. And although the school may have said, we don't see any issues, these very skilled individuals will pick up some difficulties. And then obviously carrying out further autistic specific observations, as we discussed. And really important to really gather information from all those many different sources when you're looking at the criteria. And also to remember that assessing for autism is qualitative and it must be multidisciplinary. So many of the families I work with, the professionals they've come across are working in silos, often being told it's someone else's job. It's incredibly frustrating for them, and they're the sort of go-between between people. I gave a talk, I think 2, 3 years ago to Skylarks when I was, I think I called it "Whose Job Is It Anyway?" in between health and education, and often there's a sort of a tussle between the two, and obviously his families and the children are caught between it, saying, "Well, unless this person sees them, we can't move on," and that's just really unhelpful, and it isn't correct. And this is one of my favorite slides, which really sums that up. This is a little story about 4 people named Everybody, Somebody, Anybody, and Nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that someone would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized everybody wouldn't do it. Ended up that everybody blamed somebody, but nobody did what anybody could have done. And I certainly see with the client base that I'm working with, huge exasperation there, where I try and work with families and empower them to make sure that everyone is working to support your child. So going back to those nice guidelines, considering which assessments are needed for the profile of a child. So what I've tried to do now is start highlighting the ones where there is a health assessment required. So we talked about the speech and language therapist and how important they are. That autism is an impairment in your social interaction, social communication. You may or may not have speech and language delay, but the speech and language therapist is incredibly important in this assessment. The fine and gross motor skills, which are by your occupational therapist. Adaptive behaviors, including self-help skills. This is the role of the occupational therapist. Mental and emotional health, including self-esteem. So obviously a pediatrician can be looking at that in a broad term, but obviously clinical psychologists, psychiatrists are incredibly important. And obviously they're included in the NICE guidelines. Physical health and nutrition, as we've discussed. There are 2 tertiary clinics at the Evelina. One is a specialist sleep clinic and one is a specialist behavior feeding clinic. And I'm always trying to help and empower parents to get into those very specialist clinics. But it is incredibly difficult because they only accept NHS referrals and they have to come from secondary care. And one of the issues is that there aren't any secondary care facilities. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But just to explain to you how very common and complicated the feeding issues can be, there are 6 professionals who work in the behaviour clinic at the Evelina Hospital. It can be incredibly difficult to manage and support, but of course, children desperately need that support. And so I really help to try and empower parents to be aware of those options and really help them with the obviously the local services. Sometimes I see GPs very willingly referring, but they will be rejected because quite rightly these tertiary services can be overwhelmed and they're really looking to the secondary care to provide some of that support. Sensory sensitivities, so we're going back to occupational therapy for that support. Just going back to the feeding, that's often multi-professional, and again that is between a specialist speech and language therapist and an occupational therapist. They can make huge strides in supporting these children with their fussy eating. Behavior likely to affect day-to-day function and social participation. So actually the role of the speech and language therapist, a specialist one looking at the social communication, social interaction, is incredibly important. Obviously, clinical psychologists, educational psychologists are very important as well. And then again, the socialization, social skills, that's very much down to the speech and language therapist, but really working in sort of social skills groups, supporting the child with their interaction as opposed to one-to-one therapy. Going back to so around the health assessments, when you're seeking assessments, is check the qualifications of the person that's assessing, refer back to NICE guidelines, and ensure that there's a multi-professional assessment. If you're not happy with an NHS assessment, you can discuss this with PALS. So every NHS service has a PALS, which is called a Patient and Device Liaison Service. In each local authority, there is a designated clinical officer for children, and there's also a designated medical officer. At the end of my talk, I've got some links for the Kingston and Richmond clinical officers. So if you're unhappy with your health services locally, those are the people that you can go and speak to. And as I've suggested before, really worth thinking about applying for disability living allowance, because many families are often seeking private therapy because they just can't get any other therapy or support for their families. And that can be very, very expensive. And the disability living allowance could be used to support that. So coming on to the myths, I have obviously a lot of parents contacting me, and some of these are some of the comments and myths that I have picked up when working with families. Oh, sorry, let's just go back. Just see, is that the right one? Okay. So the first myth, which we've already discussed, is that you have to get a diagnosis before you can apply for any HCP. That is not correct. There is no statutory or regulatory requirement for an assessment. The SEN Code of Practice is based on need. There's also sort of rumours around NHS standard. That's a new phrase that I've heard people talk about. There is no statutory or regulatory requirements that non-NHS private assessors must meet a mysterious NHS standard. So that is not true. It's just sort of made up. There isn't an NHS standard. Myth that autistic children don't want friends. That is not true. So I'm struggling to see my slide because there's lots of people's pictures and faces. The preference for parallel plays, social differences. So yeah, this is definitely not true that they don't want friends, as you know. Sometimes it's the quality of how those children are interacting, but certainly these blunt and blatant terms are not helpful and they're not correct. Myth that good grades and eye contact rule out autism. That is not, again, is not true. Having a good speech or good eye contact does not exclude the diagnosis. Particularly in girls, sorry, masking is very common, and this can often hide the needs. It's a myth that all autistic children behave the same. Presentations vary widely. Every child is unique. If you've met someone with autism, you've met one person who has that diagnosis. Girls and minority groups are often overlooked, and autism is often equated to outdated stereotypes. Um, another awful myth, behavior is just bad parenting. I certainly see a lot of families coming to me where there's definitely been an undercurrent of they've been blamed, lots of phone calls from school, commenting on the behavior of the child. Behavior is a form of communication. If a child is melting down, this often says they're completely overwhelmed. And the way to support them is to support, not punish. It's also a myth that schools have to spend an additional £6,000 on a child before they can request a needs assessment. That is not correct. and has been challenged in law. There is case law around that, I believe. So coming back to these NHS standards, or clinical standards, that's not true. So what there is this NHS national framework which talks around it, but in fact what it does is just refer back to NICE guidelines. So those are the only statutory regulations or that anyone should be looking at if they want to challenge assessment or they want to challenge report. Another myth that independent expert reports are not accepted by local authorities. It is unlawful for a local authority to adopt a blanket policy of refusing to consider an independent expert report submitted by parents. Special Educational Needs and Disability Regulations 2014 states that in the early phase of an EHC needs assessment process, parents or the young person have a statutory right to share any reports or information which they wish to submit considered by the local authority. There is nothing within the legislation that precludes local authorities from accepting or considering independent reports. What I always advise parents is to request statements in writing from the case officer that they will accept the reports that they're sending through and that they will be considered by the panel. Because what often happens is that the reports are submitted, but they don't quite make it to panel for some reason. Provided that a practitioner is suitably qualified and has carried out a standardized assessment in their field and followed NICE guidelines, the NHS cannot reject the assessment. Obviously, there's often a myth that there's not enough money to support a child. Families are told their child's not bad enough, they haven't met the threshold, they're academically capable, therefore you couldn't apply for an education, health and care plan. I have had families being told that the teaching or SENCO staff are too busy and that there are other child ahead of them that require assessment first. All of those are unacceptable statements. It really comes back to my favorite slide about if obviously families not being given what they want and being told it's someone else's job and things not happening. Again, going into the silo working. So I just want to touch on one or two things which again very, very topical and really have in the last few years have become huge in my clinical practice. Emotion-based school avoidance. I have a lot of families really challenged by this and the school's recording of it and how it's being handled. Every local authority now seems to have produced their own advice on the EBSA. And if you do have a child who is suffering from this, then I would really encourage you to look up your local council's EBSA policies. It can be very difficult for schools to record it. So not being in school is emotional-based school avoidance, but also not being in class and learning with peers, even if they are on site or unable to do full days, is really also emotional-based school avoidance. Any child who is late frequently due to anxiety should have this recorded as simply as a reasonable adjustment to allow them extra scope to access the setting. And this is a legal duty imposed on every school to provide adjustments that are reasonable so a child or parent should not be penalised for this. Schools need to set up an EBSA plan and work with the local authority to get support in assisting a child to be integrated back into school or recognise that they are not in the right provision and then progress towards an EHCP application and move that child to a suitable environment. Schools are obviously very focused on attendance figures, and I know that a lot of families are often pressured to try and get their children in to school and they can be extremely distressed. Schools often require medical evidence of EBSA in the form of a GP note or from another professional, and then the school should be recording this as authorised absences. Anxiety is both an educational and a health need. and also falls under the disability definition in the Equality Act legislation. So obviously I could give quite a big talk on that alone, but I just think it's such a huge subject, so I just really wanted to touch on that. Another very topical one is pathological demand avoidance. I see a lot of families seeking this diagnosis. They've read up on Google, feel that their child really meets the criteria, although it's really important to note there is no clear accepted definition. It can make school placement very difficult. In my professional opinion, it is often significantly linked with anxiety. So if you have a child that you think has PDA symptoms, I would really, really encourage you to get them seen by a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So what does good support look like? Well, I think sensory accommodations are really, really important. Predictable routines and visuals, clear communication with the child and also with professionals and yourselves, a safe regulation space, and strength-based approaches. Very quickly, just touching on AHCPs, really important to understand it is education, but it is also health and care. And I often see that those two areas get really missed. So it's really important to think about the EHCP. It's a 24/7 approach. There should be support for the families, and it shouldn't just be seen as a 6 hours of school. And I appreciate it's very, very difficult to get an EHCP. I've given you a list of education advocates that will be in my last slides. And I'd really encourage any of you, if you are applying for an EHCP or you're not happy with the EHCP that you have for your child, is that you really seek education advocacy advice. Obviously, there's the wonderful Jonathan and the Skylark support as one of those avenues that you could seek support for. So really to hope that I've given you a little bit more knowledge, because knowledge is power, to support yourselves and your child, and yeah, just to really empower you. And I appreciate it's a very, very difficult struggle out there. The lack of resources and lack of appointments and availability for support is very, very difficult. But just to stress, the diagnosis does not guarantee support. And the NICE guidelines do state that families should receive information and signposting as part of their assessment. So my final message is define the need, get the correct professional assessments and support that identifies the difficulties and needs of your child, and understand that the health needs of your child may have. And it's support that matters, and diagnosis is a tool. And just really important to bust the myths to ensure that your child gets access to the services that they deserve. I've got 3 very boring slides coming up now, which are just links and resources, which hopefully you will find really, really helpful. I believe this presentation is going to be recorded, and you can access these slides because obviously these are very detailed links. But obviously this is really important ones in the next 3 slides, so rather dull, or you might want to take a screenshot if you want to get some details now. So this is around the assessment, the NHS England National Framework, which really will give you the sort of summaries that I've just been talking about if you wanted to fine tune what you should be receiving. Lots of links to independent education advice if you're looking for educational support for your children or EHCPs. There's a number of links for if you have any children who are suffering from emotional-based school avoidance. There's huge support out there now, and certainly a much better understanding than there was a number of years ago. And then just some autism masking resources, because again, this is really becoming quite an issue, and it's very subtle and really sort of a bit of quite a pushback. So a lot of this information is for schools and for staff to really understand that the child that just seems fine really isn't fine and is masking in school. So I'll just take it back to this one here. But that's me done. What I'll do is I'll move this on in a minute and then another minute. But if we wanted to, we could start some questions if anyone has any.